they're broadcast on our YouTube channel. But you don't need to be worried about that. We are have the recording set to only pick up those of us who are unmuted and speaking into the little yellow box. So as long as you stay muted, you will not be part of the recording. But please do use the chat box at any time throughout the evening to enter any questions that you have. Davith and I will save those up and we will pose them for you at the end of the event. So please put your questions in the chat and we will ask them for you later on. Without further ado, I'm going to hand things over to Davith to introduce our guest authors this evening.
Well, thanks so much, Rachel. Tonight, we are welcoming Richard Alther for his new novel, Bedside Matters. Called a Vermont Renaissance man, Richard is an author and a painter and a master swimmer. In addition to 5 novels, he has written extensively on vegetable gardening and homesteading and has been a Huffington Post blogger for Gay Voices. He has also exhibited his art internationally in one-person shows in Montreal, London, Los Angeles, Boston, Dallas, and Florida. His new novel, as I said, is Bedside Matters. Former Governor of Vermont, Madeleine Kunin, said, "Bedside Matters is a rich and articulate example of how truths fall into place towards the end of a life." Richard Alther has written with sensitive insight into the mystery of death. We are lucky to be joined tonight by William J. Kennedy. He is Professor Emeritus of Comparative Literature at Cornell University. He contributed over 50 articles on literature, rhetoric, and literary theory to various journals and critical collections, received fellowships from the Fulbright, Guggenheim, and Rockefeller Foundations, and has written several books, most recently Petrarchism at Work, Contextual Economies in the Age of Shakespeare. Please join me in welcoming William Kennedy and Richard Alther.
Thank you.
Well, Bill.
So we start?
Go ahead. I'll hand things over.
Okay, good. Well, Richard and I are going to have a little tete-a-tete for about a half hour or so, and then you'll be typing in questions that you may have or comments you might want to make, and we'll address that at the end of it. So let's begin, Richard, with the conventional thing. How would you describe your novel? What are you doing in it, and what should we know about it?
Well, my novel is the story of a man in his final year as he's navigating a terminal illness. He is a cocooned white male of privilege. And when we meet him, he is fixated on his plight. Fixation on himself isn't particularly new. He's been that way most of his adult life. Star of his own one-man show, so to speak. And over the course of the story, he gradually comes to embrace himself as no more, no less than an everyman, that he is simply another soul, like all other living things. Walter rose from poverty to great wealth. He is a driven, self-made man, mostly ignoring his family, the wife who left him, their adult children, and he certainly wasn't aware of the plights of other people, the disadvantage. So he's a bit of a curmudgeon at start, but gradually over the course of the story, he shifts his concerns to other people who are involved in his care. So he has plenty of time to reconcile his past, being in bed, but with the help of others, his attention focuses from himself, and he discovers a world far beyond himself. There's Irma, his Hungarian-born caretaker, and eventually he gets curious about her, wants to know more about her background. There's a young teenager, Alexander, who is a fine artist, who comes across his path and brings watercolors to the bedside and has Walter propped up in his bed and taking a round at paints on his tray table. There's Tressie, who is black-brown, a woman of color, the likes of which Walter has never encountered in his life. And she's doing his nails and morphs into addressing his entire body because she's also a PT. And he forgets about himself. He can't wait for the next appointment. So in short, Walter discovers a much expanded view of his life, ironically, as he's ending his own. and he comes to learn what matters most. His ending comes on a note of grace and with a newfound peace. That's a summary. So,
I'd like to pick up on what you said about Walter's focus changing in the course of what you're writing about him. How about your focus? You obviously began this novel longer than a year ago, longer ago than we ever heard of this pandemic that's racking us now. How about your focus in writing the novel? Did that change over time? How did you grow with the novel?
well, yes, I don't think I've ever not been interested in mortality, my own, as a starting point. And this is well before the pandemic that I conceived the book and actually finished it at first drafts well before the pandemic. I came to being compelled by the whole subject. Nobody wants to talk about death. Life is for the living. Kubler-Ross was decades ago. You know, we all learned about denial to acceptance. And it seemed to me personally, who did I really take that in, her message? Does it sink into the bones? Because our whole culture is geared toward prolonging life. Life is for the living. And even those people who have living wills and don't want extraordinary means, it gets very fuzzy at the end. The will to live is so strong. For me, a classic in the 70s was Denial of Death by Ernst Becker, who was, I was like being back in college, I was underlining every other line. But the idea for this book came into being, I have to say, that long ago. In any event, I'll conclude here, Bill, for a moment by saying that in addition to prolonging life, I mean, there are all these stalling tactics. We go for second and third opinions. There may be a trial experimental drug that could keep things going. And then we have all these cliches like life is short, carpe diem, today's the first day of the rest of your life. These cliches are become invisible. You know, we take them in, but they aggregate. And they are part of the substance of what we absorb deep down, that death is something to consider way over here. To die in our sleep, that is purported to be the essence of how we would go, you know, avoid death altogether.
Yeah.
So I will talk about changing, Bill, but I wanted to say that much.
Yeah, it must be very difficult to write about dying and death, and for readers coming to it. Do we want to throw ourselves into some sort of maudlin sympathy for the character, or is there something else that you were trying to get at? And trying to let me put a point on it. One of the things that seems to obsess Walter is his money. And how he's going to use it and what he's going to do with it and so forth and so on. Why this focus on money? Is that somehow balancing your focus on death?
Yes, for me, I made that central, Walter's wealth, so that by the time he's really on his deathbed, it's a thing of the past. It doesn't matter to him. And the characters that are engaged in his care are parts of the have-not world, opposite to his. So I thought of it as another way to handle by which Walter departs himself, the whole of himself, and gets to a different place of being. You know, I have to throw in this one-liner that is central to my book. Years ago, when Barbara Bush was First Lady, she gave a commencement address at Wellesley College, and she said something that just got lodged in my noggin. Nobody winds up on their deathbed wishing they had spent more time at the office. And that is part of the element that got me going in this direction. And change, Bill, you asked. Yes, I would talk about that in a moment, but yes, absolutely. Where this book, I knew where it would start and where it would end with Walter's leave-taking. I wasn't really sure how he would progress through this and what would literally happen for him and the reader at the very end. It's a process that I felt I was almost the medium, and I was allowing Walter to follow through on his journey.
Yeah.
So that was a
For
change.
our guests who have joined us, I have to say that Richard and I have had quite a bit of conversation going back and forth about what we'd speak about tonight, what Richard would tell us about his novel. And I suggested that Richard explore some of the other characters in the novel and their relations with Walter. And Richard said, no, he wanted to focus on Walter, but those characters are so marvelous. And I really think that you'd be shortchanging your potential readers to focus on Walter and Walter's death. So just take one character, select one character
I'll take his, thank you. I'll take his daughter, Paula.
Yeah.
And Paula has turned into a tycoon in her 40s. And so she's really a chip off the old block. But in her interactions with Walter at his bedside, she becomes more a cause for him of grievance than pride. He sees himself in her, a carbon copy of where he's been, and he's not so comfortable with that anymore. He's also becomes leery of her because she has a power of attorney over him, and she's a financial pro, and he decides to try to sneak some gifts out of his vast riches without her knowing it. And that leads to an explosive situation for them, since she and her brother are the heirs, as is the case with so many families. And I would say her brother, Gavin, who has been in and out of drug rehab and his whole life, her total opposite. Walter never was much involved with his care, but here at this juncture, the last year of his life, he sees as much of his son as he does as a daughter. He has a new take on his son and the steps he has taken to sobriety and avoiding his addiction. And he becomes tremendously invested in how Gavin is going to proceed into bettering himself as well as the world.
Yeah, just as a comment on that, yeah, the son and the daughter, and you run these parallels between the son and the daughter with other parallels between characters in the novel that I think are really, really interesting. Walter's, what would you say, business partner also has children, and the same sort of dynamic between the children. One is money-oriented and successful, and the other is not, and so on. And I think it's marvelous the way these characters move around on a chessboard, and you have them going. With Walter, of course, he's the lens through whom we're seeing these characters. But still, it's wonderful. It's wonderful. What
I want to say that as a novelist, it's often chosen to get perspectives and points of view from the other characters.
Yes.
Many characters, multiple characters. And I made a decision early on. I wanted everything to go through Walter, his consciousness. I wanted this to be an X-ray of how he is approaching these final months and final days. And I'd kind of like to say that about changes, Bill. I wasn't really sure how this was going to play out, because what do we know about death? There are near-death experiences we read about, but that could be fabrication and hallucinations. But anyway, the characters are important because every one of them removes Walter from his own center stage and brings him closer to a far vaster sense of the world that he's been a part of and never really acknowledged until this point.
Yeah, and that I think is really marvelous. You began your discussion 15 or 20 minutes or so ago by saying, I asked you what is the novel about, and you said, well, it's a story about. And so the story, of course, has a beginning, a middle, and an end, or maybe a beginning and an end, or maybe not. And I know that you were reluctant to speak about that too, and without giving too much, because you didn't want to give too much away to potential readers. But without giving away to potential readers what happens, the first half is an introduction to this parade of characters. And then in the second half, Walter doles out gifts to them, parting gifts to them, some of which are rejected, some of which are accepted, some of which are conditionally accepted, etc. And that in itself is a fascinating development. So I guess the question that I'd ask you, what is the takeaway from that? In the beginning, that you got this assemblage of people, and at the end, they're there, and Walter's, of course, trajectory is predictable from beginning to end. He's dying. So what is the takeaway from this sense of relating to people late in life, or any other takeaway that you might want to
yes, it's not giving away that he does decide to make gifts to other people and organizations. And this helps define Walter because in many of these instances, the person to whom he's making this gift is very grateful, but declines because we see Walter, even though he's attempting to leave the whole of the person he's been, he's still a manager. He's still trying to manipulate and control the situation. For example, his ex-wife, Polly, who has a major role both in his recollections of their life together, as well as she coming to his bedside several times in an affable way, well after their divorce. He attempts to give her a major gift to the National Organization of Planned Parenthood, with which she's very instrumental. And she calls him on it because she left him in the marriage. And she immediately senses that it's his final bid for her forgiveness of having left the marriage, and that's not in her to do, and she really backs away from what's almost seen as an intrusion into her life. She's just coming to tend him and wish him well, and they share a family and share a lot about that. Yeah. That's just an example. If that,
yeah, no, that's. I think that's an illuminating example for potential readers. Again, it has a trajectory of its own. On the blurb of your novel, or at least the advanced copy that I got, it says that you were trying to make it cinematic. And I wonder what you mean by that, cinematic, in style, in approach, and narrative.
That's what folks involved with my publisher said. I didn't.
Maybe from a reader's report. I mean, this happens. You find readers' reports, and then they draw from the report.
I'm very visual. I mean, I'm a painter.
Yeah.
I've been as much of a painter as a writer, and it's very important to me to draw the picture. Red hair or black, blue eyes or brown, body gesture this way or that. As a reader, I've always enjoyed having a grounding visually in that way. So that comes to me naturally at this point in
Yeah.
writing,
Yeah.
to do that. I just, what you were talking about change before, Bill, and I just wanted to say that it was really, what I most enjoyed about writing, which I wasn't anticipating, was the uncertainty of the story and how it would evolve. I've always written my books to raise questions and not necessarily settle on an answer.
Yeah.
But in that this was a subject that, well, who knows what to say or read about this? It's in every novel, you know, death is always in novels, but it's couched in layers of plot and other parts of the story. I wanted to do something that just took a laser beam onto this subject only.
Yeah.
And I want to get in a note about writers I grew up with that really influenced me to tackle this subject of mortality. And for me, at one point in my young adulthood, it was Bernard Malamud and Philip Roth and Saul Bellow. Their protagonists were grasping at life in a way that said, life is short, and it underscored the fragility of life. Updike is the one who really got under my skin, because as a non-Jew myself, he had his characters often at odds with the Christian faith and its orthodoxy, life after death, and so on. And that really resonated with me as I moved in my 20s from my own Protestant faith to having that external format for the end of life, if you will, reincarnation or whatever. I rejected that in a long process. And that imposes on us as individuals, it did on me, well, what am I going to make with the meaning of life, of which death is the end point? It's a challenge, and it always intrigued me since my early reading. I do want to throw in a one-liner about writing about what we know, because in this case, I almost thought it was presumptuous to tackle this subject. You know, I think most early novels are autobiographically juiced. I think they certainly work for me, and it's pretty much a given. But as we evolve in the craft, I think there's much more of an inspiration from otherwise, not actual life, but what we're finding about ourselves or digging within ourselves to uncover. That said, Doris Lessing once came out with a crack that you don't write about living in ice if you're not an Eskimo. Write what you know. And that was my byline for a while. But with this novel, the first of my 5 published novels, I've really tried to tackle something that I don't know anything about. And it's only one person's experience. And the challenge, Bill, was another part of the challenge was, how could I make that accessible? You know, Walter is on the surface privileged, white, male, all these things. But I tried to make his ending especially vague enough that a reader, myself included, could participate and feel I could identify.
Yeah.
So for me personally, it was kind of like a dress rehearsal. You know, when my time comes, I would hope I could have Walter as an example.
Yeah. Well, it's an example to follow. Let me come back to a few things. You just said a lot about the novel, a lot about yourself, a lot about your expectations. cinematic. If somebody turned this into a movie, who might you think as enacting the part, the part of Walter or other parts? Or don't you think that way?
You, Bill Kennedy.
well, you're okay. Okay, listen, I can't resist this. Neither Mary nor I ever published a fiction novel. Mary's on the screen over here. Neither of us ever published fiction, but we are characters in a series of novels by a friend we grew up with and went to college with. And the friend one day was notified that Barbra Streisand was interested in requisitioning his novel for a picture. And so he went to Hollywood with his agent and so on and so on and so on. I said, Jimmy, whatever you do, sign me up for the role of X in this novel. Make sure, I don't care what Mary, if she wants to do what she wants to do, I want to do X on the screen. Well, Jimmy came back and he said, yes, it was a wonderful session we had with Barbara. And then the next day we went to Jack Lemmon's for lunch. And I went up and I took his Academy Awards and I held them in my hand and I said, I want these. I said, Jimmy, I want them too, but Jack Lemmon's not getting the part. The picture never came about. It's one of these things that collapsed. But I often wonder,
well,
Jack Lemmon?
I was joshing. Walter doesn't have a surname in the book, and he's bald, and I think he's described as earlyish elder. He's really nondescript compared to the other characters. I guess I'm thinking out loud that happened because I wanted him to be more neutral than otherwise, so that he would have a chance to be more identifiable.
Yeah.
So that would take an actor, a man, the equivalent of, Meryl Streep, who can be anything and anybody. With all due respect, I just saw the Tom Hanks movie, and for me, he's Tom Hanks in everything he does. Yeah. I see Tom Hanks. So it's an actor, who would really downplay a lot of personal, highly identifiable features. So, a bit more about this, getting the reader to participate in Walter's dying. Actually, the Impressionist painters, we're all well acquainted with them. And I wanted the ending of the book to be sort of that way, slightly vague, because with the paintings, I think we're invited to participate and complete the picture, as opposed to something representational and highly literal. And that was another inspiration for me, to keep this story as open and to readers embracing it without putting Walter off on an island of his own.
Yeah, no, that's a question that I did want to ask you too. That you're a painter, you've done oils, you've done watercolors, you've done acrylics, et cetera. You're trying to express something in your paintings, you're trying to express something in your novels. This novel that you've written, by the way, and I've read all of them, is so different from the others. The first one, was a hilarious sketch of the year of blind dates. That was dating blindly. Well, what is the exact title? And it's a raucous journey through a man's effort to get laid, really. And then you wrote a novel about the Holocaust. Which had its humorous and very touching scenes in it. It involves two children, really, who do things that children do. And you go on and on and on in your progress as a writer. Now you're writing about death, and that is something. I guess what I'm trying to ask is, what differences do you see between expressing yourself in painting and expressing yourself in language, in words, in plot, in story, in characterization, in setting? How do you find working in those two media different or not?
Well, for most of my life, and half my adult life, I have been writing. I've been painting all my life. For years, I kept them very separate. I thought, well, painting is from the guts. You know, it's ordered that way, and writing is cerebral and thinking. And I came to realize that for 20 years, I've been doing nothing but large abstract oils. And I realized when I'm slashing away at a canvas, every few minutes I step back and think, oh, this isn't so mindless. There should be some violet over here by the purple, So there is intellection there. And conversely with writing, for me personally, it's become more and more, happily for me, a chance to dig deep inside and uncover thoughts and ideas and emotions I didn't even realize I had. When I wrote this book, unlike any of my prior books, well, the prior one I did write start to finish without stopping, but this book, Bedside Matters, I literally began with chapter 1 with legal pad and pen and black ink, and I went right through to chapter 20 with this pile of paper. And then I went through it all once in blue ink, but I went through the whole process over many months. And that was thrilling, and I realized I start at 10 in the morning in my quiet place. And then all of a sudden I'm in a sweat-soaked t-shirt. It's 5 or 6 o'clock in the afternoon. And I come up for air and I think, oh my God, what have I done? Where have I been? And that's been a remarkable journey as a writer, because I know that the subconscious, as best we or I am able to tap it, has come into play. Almost akin to keeping a dream notebook those years when you try to grab these thoughts that you wouldn't have otherwise.
Yes. And
so I see the crafts, in my case, Bill, interweaving, and I think each benefits.
Yeah, one of the things that I've got to say as a writer, of course, of academic literary study, historical study, critical study, etc., it's quite different from writing fiction. But there is one thing that I think those of us who write and publish bear in mind, that there's no such thing as good writing. There is only good rewriting. There's only good rewriting. I would go a step further and I say there's no such thing as good reading. There's only good rereading. It's the second time you read a novel, a poem, a play, that you really get it. But to go back to this business about revision, I find that when I'm writing, that's where my ideas come out, is in the revision. I don't sit down and say, this is what I'm going to say, because I really don't know what I said until I said it. And then I go back through a stage of rewriting and rewriting the rewriting and rewriting the rewriting and rewriting. And so one of my students once said, hey, that's like pumping iron. You're just doing it over and over and over again. I said, yeah, but that's when you really, really get to know what you're really thinking, because you change it. You change the inflection, you change the scope, you change the dynamics, the tone, and so on. You say you legal paper, me too. Black ink, me too. First revision, blue ink, me too. Pencil, then typing it out, and then, and so on and so on and so on. So that process is I have aspirations to being a visual artist, but my efforts to do oil and watercolor, God forbid, are just awful. One thing that I think about writing is that you can revise. You can't revise a watercolor, or maybe you can. I don't know. You got to get it right the first time. If you're sculpting something and you chip off the nose, you can't revise that statue. But in writing, it's a process of revision. Does that make any sense to you, or am I just hallucinating here?
I'm sure I love to rewrite. Bedside Manners has had 20 drafts.
There you go.
I love to throw out sections that I've fallen in love with.
There you go.
Because it gives me a chance to rewrite. And the whole business of being a novelist for me is the process is the payoff. It's thrilling. And that said, nothing as thrilling as that first draft that came out.
Right.
Because by the 10th and 20th draft, it is cerebral. It is thinking and it is refining. I very much enjoy doing it, but it's not as much fun as at the beginning. But I'm no stranger to editing my own work. I have no problem doing that.
Yeah, I once, for a joke, really tried to estimate how long it took me to write a page and that eventually broke into print. And I came down to something between 7 and 10 hours. Now, that's not that I spent 7 or 10 hours on that single page in one sitting. It was a first draft, it was a second draft, it was a 10th draft. It was a draft that I threw out and 10 drafts later brought back in again. So that sense of putting that amount of time, and I say this again to get into the whole idea of the economics of publishing and writing, and what writers do and what they earn and what they deserve and so on. That labor is just not immediately apparent on a single printed page or any printed page. It's or ultimately it is, because if it's good, it's there. It's apparently good, and that's what I can say about your fiction.
Well, I probably spent 3 years on this. Happily, I'm fortunate not to earn a living anymore. A big factor, you know, I'm having as much fun, Bill, as I did as an undergraduate, because, you know, I get to wallow in all these books that I'm reading for reinforcement, filling notebooks with ideas. And, you know, I've said to others, in my day at our university, if psychology had been more than rats and mazes and cages, I would have become a psychologist or a psychiatrist. I mean, those friends of mine who did become such were just like me, trying to find out what makes themselves tick, and others in the process. But, you know, they were pretty screwed up. That was certainly my inspiration. My alternative was studying literature, which has always given me the chance to first learn about others, and then sidestepping myself entirely and getting engaged in characters. But for me, the beauty of fiction is it all sinks down and settles into the marrow, where you can't necessarily see it and feel it, but it has such a great influence. Otherwise, I'd sit around and read nonfiction.
Sounds good. Is it time to open up our discussion to all these wonderful people who have joined us?
Yes. Thank you so much, Bill. Thank you, Richard. Please, if you have any questions, type them into the chat. But I've got one to start us off, Richard. As both a painter and a novelist, I was wondering, do you ever write about art or visual art in your writing? Do you write about the act of painting, or
Yes,
any ekphrasis?
Yes, my prior novel, Roxy and Fred, the conceit for that was digging into the roots of creativity, the psychology of creativity. I wanted to see inside my brain, as best I could, what's going on when I'm standing at the easel. So that is how it got started. And my protagonist meets up with another painter, and they have a lot of discourse about her painting, his painting, and I got into it in quite a bit of depth. without my realizing it, it turned into a love story because there's 40 years between them, and it goes off in that direction. But yes, that's the most serious slant I've taken at what you just asked, David. I thought I was going to be asked, but maybe a reader will, I mean, a participant will say, but I wanted to get this quote in from a hospice physician who influenced me with his book a couple of years ago. And the quote is, "To share life with death or to be robbed by death." And that was very seminal in me taking this to task. You know, I'm egocentric as any other person born in the West. I mean, we're meant to be rugged individuals. I was determined through a lifetime of reading other literature, especially from the Eastern cultures. I wanted to try to go from that singular point of view to a character being one of multitudes, and how that process could alleviate suffering, wanting, pain, misery, and fear of death above all. So that's what I attempted to do with my story. I wish I had put this into the book. It's like we start off as a boulder on the beach, and in time, maybe over eons, we wind up as a grain of sand. And I think there is a little something like that in the story, because that was my goal, to have Walter wind up and not feel insignificant for it by any means. In fact, not an obliteration, but a becoming. So that's what I was striving for. And thank you for giving me the chance to talk about my story.
There's a question in here in the chat from Lewis Philpor. He says, Richard, what do you think might be your inspiration for your next book?
Well, at the end of Roxy and Fred, it won't ruin the story if somebody hasn't read it, there's an assisted suicide with the lovers. And I finished that story and I said, Richard, you're not finished with this subject. There's more to say. And that launched me to Bedside Matters. So we'll see what gestates. I don't churn them out, you know, these stories, but every 2 or 3 years. I'll tell you one thing that was asked of me, what are you reading, Richard? And I said, well, I'm reading what I would never have written or write. It's an 800+ novel in small type called A Little Life. It was 6 years ago, a Booker and a National Book Award finalist. And I had 2 trusted reader friends who said it's genius. I had another trusted reader friend who said, oh God, that's torturous. I'm reading it, I'm halfway through. And yes, it is sort of torturous for me as a wuss to withstand the self-abuse and stuff that goes on. But my reader friends who loved it, it's true, it's compelling on every page. And they said, would you ever consider writing a novel that long, even if it isn't publishable in this marketplace? Because I've just said, oh, I've got to write 70, 80,000 words tops, you know, and to be realistic, literary fiction today. And I don't have anything to prove anymore. I'm not doing this for my living and blah, blah, blah. So the seed has been put into me to perhaps come up with a story about so long, it would be so long that you couldn't help but if it was compelling enough to read, you couldn't help but come away with being so invested in that character or characters that they would make an impression for a long, long time because of the depth and length of the novel. That sounds superficial, But this novel I'm reading is giving me an example of that. And so did Shuggie Bain, another which you're familiar with, another. It's twice as long as most books these days. And that was wonderful.
There's a request here in the chat from Mary Kennedy saying, Richard, could you talk a little bit about the role that the Sufi poet Rumi plays in your book?
Well, Walter is the least likely candidate to be reading the poetry of the 13th century Persian poet, Rumi. But there's a reason. His stories of his poems have lasted through the centuries because they're entertaining. They're more funny than serious. They turn life inside out, upside down. They slide down like a sugar-coated pill that you're not quite sure what they say. This book comes to Walter from his daughter, who got it from her yoga teacher. I mean, she's feeding him books, to distract him. And this one just intrigues him to the point where it's another vehicle I have used to distract Walter from himself. And when he reads these poems, he starts keeping a little journal while he can still write with some of his favorites. So the novelistic purpose is just one more way that I'm trying to ease Walter along toward his death in a way that focuses on today, this moment, not the past and not the future. Because Rumi's stories are brilliant at seducing the reader, often with animals and other characters. And then you read it because you've swallowed it. You say, I never thought of that. I still read.
Tell us, we have hosted a number of authors during this pandemic virtually, and I've asked a number of them how it's been like, what it's been like writing during this time. But also, can you tell us what's it like painting? Has it affected your work schedule or not?
No, David. I'm affable after 5 and 6 o'clock, but I'm a loner by day, by choice. I absolutely set up solitude for writing or painting. So that really COVID has come and taken its course without much impact on me. I've got more reading done in the last year. And I happen to have lived in Vermont in spring, summer, and early fall, where I could have 1 or 2 friends at a time to sip and visit. The pandemic may be giving more attention to bedside matters because I'm just having some material published today in Writer's Digest and an essay the following week and some other online essays because my story does deal with dying and death, which is part of the national conversation because of COVID. So it's certainly affecting, my course of getting my book out there. But no, personally, it hasn't. The book was finished before it was finished before COVID.
Well, we are just about out of time, but I think for one last question, a lot of other authors have talked about how they write and whether they plot things out a lot in advance. Are you more of a plotter or a fly by the pantser, as they say?
Well, there was one note I wanted to include today, and that's, of course, we draw from our own life, even considering what I've said during this session. I was a boy in a nursing home standing next to my grandmother's casket. My grandmother, I having been raised with her my first 12 years along with my parents. And I'm looking at her casket and there's this waxen otherworldly figure, she never had rouge on her cheeks. And I'm thinking, oh, well, that's death. Nothing to do with life. And that's just the first of how many gazillion implants we have to get ourselves going in this sort of direction. I think that mortality is something we're well advised not to. I don't obsess about it. I have as a novelist, but yeah, of course, we want to make hay while the sun shines, and we should. But if more couples, more parents and children, you know, gave some due course to, well, what happens if you die first, and other realizations or just conversations about the process, it might lighten what will inevitably come. That doesn't really answer your question, David, but.
I think that's fine. I think it's a good note to end on. It's you know, that's one of the great themes. Richard, William, thank you both so much. This has been a wonderful event. The book is Bedside Matters. You can order it from Northshire Bookstore, and we will see you at another event soon.
And thank you, David, and Rachel, and everybody who's listened to Richard explain what he's doing.
Thank you. Thank you for so many people here. They're very special to me. It's almost like I'm having a wake and I'm still alive.
Oh, God.
That's a good note to end on. Thank you all so much. Have a good evening.
Good evening
Thank
to you
you.
too.
Good night.
Good night now.
Gene,